Revelation chapter 20, we hear the following. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea, and they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into a lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name is not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into that lake of fire. So as we jump into chapter 20, you have to keep in mind we are getting closer and closer to the end. So John is seeing the events that happen as the end draws near here. One thing I think is really important for you to understand, though, notice that John does not say after these things. Everything that we've looked at so far in Revelation has been really almost kind of chronological. John says, after these things, and after these things, and after these things, I saw this, that, and the other, right? What John is telling us here is that this period that we're looking at here, this 1,000 year, is not part of a timeline. It's not following the previous events that we've seen before. It is, if you will, outside of time. And that becomes really important as we take a look here at this angel over the bottomless pit who binds and throws down the dragon, right? So remember back to chapter 9. Right, Satan is given the key to the abyss. He releases the demons after the fifth trumpet. What we see here is that another angel takes and casts Satan into this darkness from which he released the demons. The thing to take note of with this is that this abyss seems to be a temporary place, a place of a brief imprisonment, as it were, as compared to the lake of fire that we'll see later on in this chapter. Again, remember 1,000 years is just a large and complete number, right? It's a number that is in control of by God. We've looked at this number before. It's a pretty well understood number. But what we see then is that after 1,000 years, Satan is going to be allowed to have his full power to afflict the church. But what we see right now is that his power is limited. Again, we don't know when this 1,000-year period is up. We don't know when it's going to be completed. But what we see is Satan is limited, and his power is drawn back. So then John's image shifts just a little bit. I always find this picture to be curious. Supposedly this is the beheading of the Apostle Paul, and you can see his head kind of glowing over there on the side, which I find kind of interesting, but it ties in really well with what we're looking at here. Because what we see is the saints of God, us. Right? John tells us that the saints of God sit on thrones and they judge the world. He makes a distinction about the beheaded ones, like I just was talking about there with the Apostle Paul. Again, this is an extreme example that he's using. It's not an exclusive one, but this is the, if you will, the most extreme way that a Christian is killed for Christ, a martyr of Jesus, the witnesses of his truth. And so, what we see is that Christians are willing to back up their testimony with their lives if necessary. This should be how we live our lives. And John wraps up this section by telling us those who had not worshipped the beast rule with Christ. Again, this ties all Christians together with Christ. This is how we know that those seated on the thrones are all of us. Alright, so all of us Christians are sitting there with Christ. And then John sees the defeat of Satan again. Right? Remember, we talked about Revelation 19. We saw the great battle and how it is that Christ comes to the rescue of the church. And John's going to see this same thing again. Right? This is another view of that same battle of Armageddon that we looked at and the defeat of Satan. Again, same viewpoint. The church is surrounded, but God intervenes to save his church. Riding down into the fray as a rider on a white horse, right? We had that imagery last time. John mentions two nations, two cities. We're not entirely sure what they mean, Gog and Magog, but there's a prophecy in Ezekiel against them. What most scholars agree upon is that they represent the enemies of the church. What that's going to mean for us at the end, we're still trying to work that out, but we have what we have for now. But what we see, right, the end result is pretty clear. Satan is thrown into that lake of fire with the two beasts that he conjured, and they do not return. So then John sees a slightly different section, right? The judgment before the great white throne. The judgment of mankind is upon us. So Satan and his demons are destroyed. Now is the time for the judgment of mankind. So what we see, right, is that earth and sky, they attempt to flee the wrath of God because they know they're about to be destroyed, and mankind cannot find anywhere to hide from the judgment of God, as if he could in the first place, right? John tells us he sees books opened, right? Books show God's lasting and unerring memory of our works. Think about it. This is going to be the longest lasting material that John has the ability to come up with as he's looking at what is going on before him. Books, once they're written, aren't able to be changed, right? Once that ink is laid across the page, that is set, as it were, almost in stone. So we have this image of God having lasting and unerring memories of our works, knowing what it is that we do. Right? The unbelievers, they're condemned because they cannot keep the law, but believers are pardoned because of the work that Christ has done. And so we see death and the grave, how they are also thrown into the lake of fire with the dragon. So the end is upon us. And that's Revelation chapter 20. A lot of blessing for the saints because now we get to go into paradise forever, and a significant warning for the unbeliever, for judgment is coming for us all.